As the men of Wisconsin and Indiana waited for orders, debates within the command of the Army of the Potomac and the Lincoln administration expostulated how the brigade and the rest of the Army's units would be organized. George McClellan made the Army into his image months before and took immense pride in it. As a result, the Army started finding its identity concerning the training that McClellan brought to them. The training, discipline, morale improved dramatically in the Army as a result. Soldiers took great pride in the Army and their commander. On March 8, 1862, Lincoln released Presidential General Orders No. 1 and No. 2, directing the Army to be divided into corps. For historical context, and I want to put this very clearly, the way that Army corps in the Civil War were organized goes back to Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon and his armies fought, he thought that organization was the key to military success. To do that, Napoleon divided his army into different groups. The command structure was more assembled and accessible to know what was going on, and as a result, corps were created. Corps, as a result, would be divided up in this structure. You have a commanding general of that corps, then there would be divisions commanded by divisional commanders. Then there were brigades, which were groups of regiments, cavalry, and artillery, and which were grouped into one unit. For infantry, it would be 4 to 5 regiments. Then those brigades would be composed once again of regiments, cavalry, and artillery. And then it would go down onto companies, platoons, squads, etc. Since McClellan, Irvin McDowell, and other commanders of the Army went to the West Point Military Academy in New York, this is what they were taught. And that is how the Army was organized. The 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, along with the 19th Indiana, were 4 regiments as a result. They would be assigned to the 1st Corps. Irvin McDowell, the previous commander of the Army, would be assigned to command the 1st Corps. The brigade would be assigned to the 1st Division of the 1st Corps, with Rufus King as the division commander. After the organization of the Army, there would soon be activity for the Wisconsin and Indiana men, as well as the 1st Corps. Across from the Rappahannock River in Virginia, specifically in Gordonsville, Confederate forces threatened Washington, D.C. after the First Battle of Bull Run and were heavily concentrated there for an advance. To convince McClellan that there was a larger force threatening him, Confederate forces withdrew from Northern Virginia to draw Union forces out of Washington. General McClellan, convinced of this, ordered McDowell and the 1st Corps to advance on Centreville, Manassas, and Leesburg to drive Confederate forces back. The soldiers, officers, and others of the Wisconsin and Indiana regiments were part of this advance. They picked up their gear, formed up, and marched toward Fairfax Courthouse on March 10th. The brigade would reach Centreville the next day. Once the brigade reached the town, however, they noticed fortifications that were abandoned and immediately noticed fake guns on the ramparts. These were called by the men Quaker guns, logs that were made out to be artillery. McClellan had been duped. While the brigade awaited orders, they remained in Centreville for the time being. Because the Confederates abandoned their fortifications, they also decided to burn down any ammunition, food, and other military necessities. This fascinated the soldiers of the brigade. Some soldiers wrote home of, quote, atrocities committed by Confederates where they desecrated Union graves or used other materials made of the skulls of Union soldiers, even though these letters were more ingrained with myth than reality. Because of the deception, and as a result, General McClellan falling for it, the brigade, as well as the rest of the 1st Corps, were ordered to march back to their positions on Arlington Heights outside of the capital. On March 17th, about 6 to 7 days later, the 1st Corps and the brigade were to be left behind to guard D.C., while McClellan and the Army of the Potomac were beginning the Peninsula Campaign. While the Army began the campaign, the brigade and the rest of the Corps marched to Alexandria and camped there while the rest of the Army joined the campaign. After being stationed there for 2 weeks, the 1st Corps and the brigade would be ordered to march toward Fairfax Seminary. On April 1st, they would be separated from the Army of the Potomac. Instead of joining the Peninsula Campaign, they would be in the area to help defend Washington against any Confederate offensive. This was done to shore up defenses against Thomas Stonewall Jackson since his proximity was in the Shenandoah Valley. As a result, the brigade, as well as the rest of the Corps, would have to defend the northern and eastern areas of Virginia. During this time, General McDowell's command would be formed into a military department that oversaw the area of operations, called the Department of the Rappahannock. After this formation, McDowell would order the First Corps and the brigade to march out of their encampments in Alexandria to Fredericksburg, the department's headquarters. On April 4th, the brigade would march to Fairfax Courthouse, then to Bristow Station. The brigade would remain there until April 13th, but not before they had to deal with incessant rain, not to mention that snow was also in the mix, as well as thick mud, produced by all three of the elements. The potent rain that the men of the brigade experienced forced them to stay in their tents, sometimes makeshift shelter tents. For days until April 13th, Alan T. Nolan, in his work on the military history of the Iron Brigade, wrote about how Captain Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin experienced these harsh conditions. Rufus Dawes found that after the rain, his boots were so wet that he could not get them on, which necessitated more confinement until the boots dried out. On April 13th and the days following, the rain finally stopped. After being confined due to the heavy elements, the brigade resumed its march toward Catlett Station. Once they reached the station, they were assigned to repair rail on the Alexandria and Orange Railroad. With other brigades arriving to reinforce the area, Union headquarters would make their stay in Falmouth, just across the river from Fredericksburg. To double their numbers, the brigade would also reinforce the other Union brigades, and as a result, occupied Falmouth as well as the environs of Fredericksburg itself. Nolan once again describes how the soldiers reacted to the town in ways that there was some joy among the enslaved, but despair among the white residents of the town. After the occupation, Nolan describes the experience of the soldiers from Wisconsin and Indiana. The common soldier was at rest, free from either arduous duties or the risk of combat. For the Western soldiers, this was becoming the rule and not the exception, and it appeared as if they never were to get into the real war. The brigade, as well as the rest of Union forces, would occupy the town. As soldiers of the brigade milled about town, they would do various tasks there and there. Nolan again describes this, where McDowell's men took over the town, operating the wagon, blacksmith, and other mechanical shops. Some of Cutler's men took possession of the newspaper plant and briefly published a newspaper of their own called the Christian Banner, printed on brown and wrapping paper. Being in a state that seceded from the Union, the residents of the town did not take too kindly toward the Union soldiers. To make the tensions between the residents and soldiers even more cumbersome, the soldiers and residents also attended church in the town together. Sometimes the brigade officers went to church, but some soldiers, despite their reservations, were ordered to go. Rufus Dawes attested to this when a soldier from his company in the 6th Wisconsin decided to abscond from his duty of attending worship. Despite the tensions, both citizenry and soldiers got along in attending worship services. And despite Confederate sentiments of the congregations, the soldiers were generous when the plate was passed. But they were not so generous when a minister omitted from the service the usual prayer for the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. After church, a committee of soldiers waited upon him to advise that his church would be burned down if he failed on the following Sunday to pray for the President. The cleric was a man of discretion, and the prayer was included in the next service. But these were not the only tensions that soldiers, townsmen, and women had to deal with. There were also tensions concerning money. Prices were high. A pound of tea sold for $7. In addition, the Confederate storekeepers would not accept United States funds, and the soldiers would not recognize Confederate currency. But Yankee ingenuity was not long daunted, and the soldiers were soon counterfeiting Confederate money in large quantities, thus solving both the difficulties of high prices and exchange. As the men kept milling about in Fredericksburg, a new commander would come and take over the brigade, an artillery officer that would change the image of the unit as well as create Civil War history as a result. His name was John Gibbon. Born in a neighborhood of Philadelphia called Holmesburg in 1827, Gibbon grew up in Pennsylvania. But by the time he was 10, his family had moved to North Carolina, although he never wrote of it. Having grown up in the South, he was undoubtedly familiar with Southern views, but not sympathetic to the Southern cause. And you can imagine the tension and pressure that Gibbon faced, but instead of giving up, he decided to stay with the Union after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in 1861. His devotion to the Union was very evident in his letters to his wife. But he knew that with immense awareness at the fact that 3 brothers and 2 brothers-in-law had cast their lot with the Confederacy. Graduate of West Point, Gibbon would be assigned with McDowell's First Corps. It was appointed its chief of artillery. Gibbon was the consummate soldier, and he also took pride in discipline and identity, and taking pride in one's fulfillment that he believed would make the soldier a very faithful and loyal one. This mindset would help him in the long run. On May 2nd, 1862, he was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers. 6 days later, he was given command of Rufus Kane's brigade, composed of the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana. This road to command the brigade did not come easy for General Gibbon. Politics play a huge role in military endorsements, because Gibbon, despite being born in the North in a loyal Union state, his family moved to North Carolina where Gibbon lived his early life, thus bringing suspicion to Union commanders as well as the United States Senate. Being validated and endorsed by General McDowell, Gibbon's nomination was sent to the Senate beside other nominations for command of the brigade. As a result, the artilleryman was passed over by the Senate because of the temporary absence from that politically sensitive body of senators looking after the interests of deserving North Carolinians. Once Gibbon heard that the Senate did not nominate him, he disputed the result to General James Wadsworth. Wadsworth was politically prominent in these matters, and as a result, he represented Gibbon to the Senate on his behalf. As a result of this political wrangling, the Senate finally approved and confirmed his nomination for brigade command. After this controversy, Gibbon headed to Fredericksburg to command the brigade. Gibbon, however, was not going to be congenial to these soldiers. Gibbon was a consummate soldier, as we described earlier, who believed in the discipline and identity. But there was one thing that Gibbon saw in the soldiers of the brigade. To Gibbon, the men of the brigade were not, of course, entirely unknown quantities. In the first few days of his new command, Gibbon was confirmed in his opinion of these volunteers. If nothing else, they were intelligent and eager, more so than the regulars of Gibbon's experience. Gibbon knew it wouldn't be easy due to some habits he saw in these soldiers. Gibbon, as a result, would start instituting discipline right away, and Nolan again describes these actions that Gibbon undertook. Among their minor vices was the stealing of fences for either for fuel or for shelter, or out of pure mischief. Gibbon instituted a simple but effective solution. When a fence was torn down, the regiment camp nearest to it was required to rebuild it. Though the rebuilding of fences infuriated the soldiers, fence stealing was thereafter on the wane. Gibbon also believed that appearance and pertinence in their attitude as soldiers were just as vital to discipline and morale. Gibbon would institute a policy of giving the well-turned-out soldier a 24-hour pass for blackberrying, and discovered that this worked miracles in the appearance of men. Gibbon also instituted more rigid regulations for sentries. Because scurvy impacted the soldiers' diet, a new diet of fruit helped them maintain their health and their appearance. For sentries, they were always expected to be aware, and when they saw an officer, they had to salute them, no matter the rank. Soldiers would be disciplined in various ways if this requirement was not met. From early morning to late in the evening, the brigade would drill, do formations, practice with their weapons, and maintain their appearance in uniforms. Officers also were disciplined. As a result, the general discovered that none of the officers attended reveille, and an immediate and peremptory order put a stop to this, and also assisted in convincing the enlisted men that the new general was not so bad after all. To ensure that the discipline, drill, and appearance of the brigade would be impacted in this unit, Gibbon recognized that the brigade needed an identity. And what was needed was uniforms. Within a couple days of Gibbon taking command, Gibbon had black felt hardy hats issued with ostrich plumes, and soon after the regiments were issued frock coats and white leggings, the same uniform worn by regular soldiers. The white leggings in this had a purpose. They made sure that no dirt would get at the pants of the soldier, therefore maintaining the appearance that Gibbon wanted in the brigade. The soldiers and officers of the brigade loved these uniforms immediately. The white leggings, however, annoyed them. And because these leggings were meant to keep dirt from getting on the uniforms, they were also extremely hard to keep clean. Not to mention that they deduced their wages and clothing allotment to their pay. But it was the hat, and this is key, it was the hat that made the identity of the brigade meaningful. And when soldiers of the Civil War received hats, they usually received the recognizable kepi hat that signaled their volunteer status from different states. But these hats were different, as renowned Iron Brigade historian Lance Herdegen described them. The hat was a showy black felt affair looped up on the side with a brass eagle crest trimmed with an infantry blue cord and black plume, as well as the brass infantry bugle, company letter, and regimental numeral. It was the hats that left a striking impression, making the rangy Westerners look taller and more distinctive, and soon other soldiers, seeing these uniforms, were starting to begin talking of the black hats. In the future, however, these hats will make the brigade's identity famous. Due to the leggings and sometimes their frustration with the soldiers, some soldiers of the brigade decided to have fun with the new commander. Deciding to make jokes with the leggings, soldiers found Gibbon's horse and put leggings on the horse's legs. Gibbon woke up one morning and found this. Let's say that this prank did not amuse him one bit. Being the consummate and professional soldier that he was, he did not take a liking to this, but would eventually let it go. Once the brigade replaced their gray uniforms and donned the blue coats and black hats, they now had a new problem: disease. When the brigade came together, they had an original recruitment strength of just 4,000 men. From the number of the 2nd Wisconsin's Bull Run losses had been deducted. A consolidated morning report in the middle of 1862, before the brigade had been engaged in combat, showed but 2,800 men present for duty. Because of soldiers being recruited to other assignments, as well as diseases killing some of the men of the brigade, like dysentery, diarrhea, typhus, etc., took their toll. But sooner or later, they would be issued orders. On May 17th, General McDowell was notified by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that he was to march to Richmond to relieve a division commanded by James Shields after their defeat by Stonewall Jackson at the Battle of Kernstown 2 months earlier during the Shenandoah campaign. Once the Black Hats saw the brigade, they immediately helped resupply Shields' men with food, ammunition, and anything else that Shields required. Shields and Gibbon's men, however, did not take a liking to each other, because one side said that Gibbon's men were too well dressed for battle, and that Gibbon's men looked down on the soldiers of General Shields as very dirty. As a result, Shields' rear guard pounded into Falmouth on May 23rd. They were not the only of the arrivals that day, however. President Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and their part also arrived. The president reviewed the troops and received the general officers. And here, John Gibbon shook the homely president's hand and was asked by him if the general had written The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Lincoln was referencing British and Enlightenment historian John Gibbon, who wrote the famous work. McDowell and the rest of the First Corps were ordered to march to Richmond, and that Rufus King's division, the division that the Black Hats are in, would lead the advance. Stonewall Jackson and the Confederate command, on the other hand, were trying to prevent this maneuver. They felt that now was the time to strike while Union forces lingered in the Shenandoah Valley, and as a result, on May 23rd, Jackson struck Front Royal and seized the Federal supplies and stores accumulated there. This would immediately get the attention of McDowell as well as President Lincoln. Despite their discussion about the possible move to Richmond, Lincoln ordered McDowell that the move to Richmond was out, and that he would need to send his soldiers to the valley to thwart Jackson's offensive. Gibbon and the brigade were already on the march when they received the order to halt the offensive and immediately march back to Fredericksburg to receive new orders. Instead of Richmond, they were ordered to march to Catlett's Station. They marched in severe heat until they reached the station. All this was done to trap Jackson and stop his offensive. A couple days later, on May 30th, the brigade would march again, but this would be their hardest march ever. The brigade took to the road at 8:30 a.m. to pursue their most grueling march to date. It was one of those humid days with intermittent rainstorms, which ruined the roads but did not mitigate the heat. The soldiers had not gone far before they began to shed their excess equipment, but even with their lightened burden, many men simply could not make it. And in the 6th Wisconsin, 150 men fell by the roadside, later to revive and catch up with the column as it went to camp. But there was one element that the brigade was starting to match their identity as well, and was their camaraderie and brotherhood. One soldier, Abe Fletcher of the 6th Wisconsin, showed this brotherhood when he carried his own knapsack, but he also carried 2 more belonging to less favored of his companions. While on the march, soldiers of the brigade noticed a Confederate soldier who deserted his unit. The soldiers made a comment that compared the difference between the Union and Confederate armies. Because of the heat, the heavy gear, and their utter exhaustion, one Wisconsin soldier will later write that he wished that they were killed in battle rather than die on the side of the road like an animal. After a grueling march, they finally made it to Cadlet Station, but once again, new orders were issued. The brigade was now ordered to march to a town miles outside of Front Royal, and again marched to await orders. This was done to, once again, trap Jackson, but the strategy was not working, and as a result, Jackson managed to escape due to mistakes made by Union commanders. Because of this slip-up, King's division and the brigade were to march back to Fredericksburg and Falmouth. Once the division and the brigade reached Falmouth and Fredericksburg, there was a command change in the 6th Wisconsin. Rufus Dawes would be given the rank of major in the 6th, but was disputed because of higher rank issues within the regiment. Politics was involved in every regiment, and this was certainly no surprise in the 6th. Because of these command issues, Dawes had the best paper claim because he was a senior captain, but his seniority was only technical because the relative seniority of the captains had been settled by lots. Colonel Cutler, Lysander Cutler, also had a candidate. He wanted Frank A. Haskell as his major, and he sought to mitigate seniority claim by assembling and polling the officers. When the votes were counted, Dawes was the winner by 14 votes to 13. In Madison, the partisans of Dawes and Haskell besieged the governor, Alexander Randall, urging one another for men of the advancement. Dawes would win out in the end, and as mentioned before, would become Major Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin. These issues would also occur in the 2nd and 7th Wisconsin as well as the 19th Indiana. But despite this, after the marching, training, discipline, new uniforms and hats, along with the grueling marching that they had to endure, the soldiers, officers, as well as General Gibbon had time to process and reflect on these events as they transpired. Because of their marching, the abortive movement to catch Stonewall Jackson was looked back on in anger. Gibbon's soldiers held McDowell responsible for the failure. They argued that he was at least incompetent. John Gibbon did not share these views, but he had his own critical ideas of the situation. He reasoned that the Federals' failure was the result of bungling by the Washington administration, which had made the strategic decisions and directed the troop movements. They believed that the war would have been in the hands of the military, free and clear of the political objectives and necessities of the war, and uninhabited by civilian control. The brigade, however, despite their anger and reflections of the late marches, they were hardened and experienced now as a result of them. They would, once again, remain in Falmouth and await new orders, for they now knew for sure that they would be ordered to march for a campaign that they believed would bring the war to a close.